Good morning, America. Well, I should change my trademark Hollywood-inspired salutation and say good morning, world, because we have had more than 4,000 people from all over the world tuning in for ISOJ online. So it's truly a global conference, and I couldn't be happier than I am now. Thank you all for joining me today as we come together virtually before we begin our keynote session, our fascinating keynote session today. I would like to do a few housekeeping reminders. The panels, keynote sessions, workshops will all be interpreted into Spanish. If you would like to join and watch in Spanish, click the interpretation globe in the meeting options down below on Zoom and select a Spanish language channel. Please also note that we are live streaming on ISOJ YouTube channel, Night Center and ISOJ channels. You can find those links at isoj.org. So if you have any tech issues with Zoom and want to go back, go to YouTube, please. If you are having any further tech issues, please contact our tech helpline via WhatsApp or text at 1-817-526-0179. Also, please remember to follow and use hashtag ISOJ2020. Let's tweet about it, people. Let's tweet about it. In ISOJ in Austin, we normally have a big screen there with the tweets rolling, and it's very exciting. So go to tweet and tweet about this and the other sessions, and be connected with us on social media. I now want to take a moment to give an incredibly huge thank you to our sponsors. Thanks to Knight Foundation, Google News Initiative, Microsoft, Univision, JSK fellowships at Stanford, the Trust Project, and the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin for your contributions and support. Now I would like to introduce you and to welcome our keynote speakers, Emily Ramshaw and Amanda Zamora. We are so proud of them. You know, I have never seen a launch of a news startup in the United States that has been so successful even before launching. It's really incredible what you're gonna be learning now about this incredible, fantastic project. But to chair and moderate this session, I'm calling Matt Thompson, editor-in-chief for Review from the Center for Investigative Reporting, who was a great keynote speaker for ISOJ last year. So Matt is with you now.
Excellent. Hello. Thank you so much, Rosenthal. Thank you to everyone watching for joining us. I am delighted and honored to be joined by Emily Ramshaw and Amanda Zamora. Emily is the co-founder and CEO of the 19th, and Amanda is also the co-founder and the publisher of the 19th. Emily and Amanda previously worked together as the editor-in-chief and chief audience officer, respectively, of the Texas Tribune after a decorated career in various parts of the news industry. They have already assembled an amazing team, a veritable Marvel Cinematic Universe of journalists to launch the 19th, which I think is a factor in the already sparkling launch that Rosenthal mentioned. So Emily and Amanda, good morning. Hello.
Good morning. We're so happy to be with you. Thank you to Rosenthal for including us as always. And Matt, we're super excited that you get to be our moderator.
Likewise, super excited to moderate. Now I'll dive right in. We're in the middle of some untold number of overlapping catastrophes here in the US. And what is it like? How does one launch a giant new news operation in the middle of all of this?
Amanda, why don't you start?
Very carefully. Actually, there have been a lot of silver linings about launching in this moment in time. You know, the idea for the 19th, Emily can tell you a little bit more about how, you know, the genesis of the 19th, but we knew that there were a few things that were going to be really core to the 19th to sort of, you know, think differently about how we do journalism, politics and policy journalism particularly. One was that we were going to really focus on diversity inside and out, from the way that we hire to the way that we think about the stories, that we really wanted to think about telling nuanced stories about the lived experiences of women as an electorate, instead of, you know, starting or focusing exclusively on the horse race or the politics of things. So diversity being really key, being empathetic. And I think that has been a key ingredient internally, as we have really tried to empathize with each other. Startups are hard. They're even harder in these circumstances when you're building a team from scratch remotely, when mothers on our team have children who suddenly don't have school to go to, daycare to attend. So empathy has already been a very valuable kind of ingredient, I think. And intentionality, I think really doing everything that we can to be very intentional about how we go about hiring, how we go about, you know, developing the journalism and developing the products, and trying to be as sane as we can about not biting off more than we can chew. That said, we, as Emily already mentioned, we're definitely in startup mode, and it's been a lot. Emily, what would you say?
I mean, I would just say it was never in the cards to launch in a global pandemic. Those of you who know us know that, we are actually relatively risk-averse people, even though we're super excited about this startup. And I think, look, we had a moment back in March where we stopped and sort of looked at each other and said, in the height of COVID then, now it's even worse than it was then, but in the height of COVID then, we stopped and said, should we just hold off? We've done all this hard work fundraising. We're starting to build a team. We're going to have to hire all these people by Zoom. Should we just wait a year? And then within a couple of weeks, it became abundantly clear that this moment was even more critical for women than we had imagined. And the disproportionate effects of this pandemic on women in virtually every arena other than mortality rates was too enormous for us to overlook. In many ways, we actually sped up our plans. We had a sort of, weekly newsletter that was largely serving a marketing function, and suddenly that was the news gathering tool. We started hiring and hiring. We started, building this incredible team. And then in the midst of all of that, we entered into what I hope is really, a modern day civil rights movement. And then, thank God we had gotten off the ground, because those stories were, at the intersection of gender and racial justice were so important for us. So it has not been what we planned. This has been really, really hard. It's been hard from the standpoint of fundraising and corporate underwriting and the business model that we had counted on. It's been hard to build products, build a website, manage design and each other over Slack and Zoom. Amanda and I a few weeks ago finally got to start being in the same room together for the first time in a really long time. And I can tell you that was bliss. But this is a totally uncharted waters. As Amanda said, there are a lot of silver linings. I'm happy to talk about those in a little bit, but this is a totally surreal thing to be building your sort of life's work product amid this environment.
Yeah, well, I want to come back to some of the ways that you are launching and some of what you've put into your launch, but I want to start. So I'm eager enough to read more of your coverage that I want to satisfy myself for the moment by asking you more about how you're developing it, what your lens is. So there are any number of territories to cover right now. It's an election year. Obviously, COVID-19 and a pandemic is really just shaking the entire world, especially the U.S. And right now, where you are in Texas, there's any number of directions that you could turn. What are your principal coverage priorities as you start?
I mean, I think, so for us, we are looking at everything through the lens of what we call the asterisk. If you've seen our logo, you know that when we are devising the name of the 19th, we knew we were really interested in this sort of naming concept around the 19th Amendment, but we also knew from day one that the 19th Amendment really only extended the vote to white women. It took another 4 decades for women of color to be extended some of those same rights. And as we all know, voter suppression is an enduring challenge problem around the country. So we conceived of this idea of the asterisk as part of our logo, taking back the 19th Amendment for all women, giving all women the opportunity to see themselves reflected in the media that aims to get them more deeply engaged in our democracy. And so as we conceive of storytelling, we think about, and we actually use this in conversation all the time with our team, what's the asterisk in this story? So for us, it's not just a story if there are women involved in the story. It's not just a story, because a woman is quoted, because it features a woman. For us, we think about the asterisk as this idea of what's the disparity, what's the discrepancy, what's the way in which women are disproportionately affected by this, whether it's our economic structures and systems, whether it's our healthcare system, whether it's representative government. Our entry point for a story is the 19th asterisk, which is that gender lens. Amanda, we want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's pretty much it. And I think the other thing is just really being intentional. And I think a lot of the mainstream coverage talks a lot about women. It's not that women are not represented in the news, but we're really trying to speak to and with women about how these policies affect them in their everyday lives. And so you're going to see, obviously us covering the 2020 election and how women are running for office and getting to the ballot. but we're also going to be really trying to examine how they're affected by these issues. You know, we've got Erin who, you know, when the pandemic hit and she became sort of locked in Philadelphia and not able to get around, came up with this incredible series called Portraits of a Pandemic that was really just trying to focus on women who are at the forefront of trying to deal with this pandemic in their own communities, whether it's in education or healthcare or any of these other ways. So yeah, I think everything that Emily said, and just really also that humanization of, you know, the lived experiences of many different women as they're affected by these issues.
And that's Erin Haynes-Wack, who's been already doing some coverage under the banner of the 19th at the Washington Post, and it's been tremendous to see. I'm curious, so maybe an odd question, but I was curious to look backwards almost for a second. I'm really interested in the question, how do you think, it's hard to project forward given how much uncertainty there is around everything. What do you see missing as the press covered the 2016, 4 years ago? How do you think that coverage might have played differently, or what might you have done differently if the 19th had existed then?
Amanda, do you want to start us off?
That's a very good question. I mean, the hallmark of the 2016 election perhaps is just how surprised, you know, the nation was by just how that campaign played out. And just, I think a lot of the headlines and coverage was just, you know, of shock and disbelief. And the reality is that there is something more fundamental at play here. And we're still seeing, you know, that play out on the trail now. I mean, even more so, you know, I think perhaps it would have been really getting on the ground and, you know, instead of just focusing on, you know, we are not in the business of creating commodity news at the 19th. So, you know, a lot of the news that, you know, people are accustomed to seeing in their news feeds and their Twitter feeds and the tweets and the this and the that. Yes, it's relevant and important to try to understand and put that in context, and as much as it's really changing the dynamics of how campaigns are shaped and how people are persuaded or manipulated by mass media. But at the same time, like, what still fundamentally matters is how are women as voters, you know, coming to the election? What is motivating them to vote? What is motivating them to stay at home? How are they engaging or not engaging in the democratic process? And I think starting really from there is something that we're already focused on doing. And I wonder if we had existed and really approached a lot of the hyperbole and dramatic kind of coverage of the election, but from that ground up level, how things might have been different. I don't know, Emily, what do you think?
I mean, I was on maternity leave with my baby daughter during the 2016 election, during like really the height of the 2016 election in the lead up. And I remember, honestly, that's the first time I even considered that there ought to be something like the 19th. And I remember all of the headlines were about electability and likability, which are two concepts for me that are exclusively reserved for women and in a really outrageous way. And I try to think about, I mean, Amanda talked about covering the electorate. For us, you know, we get to steer clear of the sort of outrage patrol headlines, and we get to focus deeply on nuance and the reality that women are not monolithic and that their views are complex. I think, you know, Amanda talked about empathy a couple of minutes ago, and I hate to reuse this word again, but empathy in coverage is exceedingly important to me, to us and to our team, really understanding not just how women vote, but why they vote the way they vote, what the circumstances are that are devising their set of lived experiences and beliefs. And I think having the ability to go deep on that, you know, we've hired a founding team of reporters who are all over the country. They're not, you know, just in New York and DC, they're in Orlando, they're in Des Moines. You know, it's really exciting for us to be able to have reporters on the ground who get to cover women in parts of the country that are often treated, we know too well, sort of as, you know, like flyover country.
Within the industry, both of you have been leaders in shaping how we think about audiences, not just the coverage itself, but also who the publics that we're creating, that we're reaching. And I'm curious, how are you thinking about and prioritizing those different segments of the public that you're hoping to reach and empower? Who will be the most important leaders?
To be clear, Amanda is the national expert on audience, not me. So take it away.
I mean, this is hard. I think this is one of the things I most appreciate about working in nonprofit news. First of all, I think this is another reason why, just coming back to why the 19th exists the way that it does, we did evaluate the model. We didn't necessarily assume we were going to do another nonprofit, even though that's totally in our DNA at this point. But we chose to be a nonprofit because we think that that affords us the time and the space to invest in the kind of substantive journalism and steer clear of a lot of the commodity news that commercial newsrooms are, forced to chase sometimes to scale and, gather the advertising revenue that they need. And B, to also be super intentional about the audience development strategy. So we do have, we think about our audiences in two key segments: the core audience that we need to build, and those are women who are probably more likely to read the news, who are probably already civically engaged, they're voting, they're educated, they're sort of plugged in. We need those readers in order to, be sustainable, to monetize, to gather the corporate sponsorship, to get a critical mass to our owned and operated platforms, and to convert members in a way that, we can see that what we're doing is working. If we do a good job of growing that core audience, that revenue allows us to extend beyond and to gather this big tent audience. And that's where we really go where the journalism requires us to go. So that, we are talking to women of all backgrounds, whether it's geographically, ideologically, socioeconomically, figuring out what redistribution means for us, what partnerships mean for us, going into community with events and stories that are relevant to those communities. So that kind of audience development takes real effort and resourcing, and it doesn't happen without you deciding that it's going to happen. And so that's how we kind of think about, our audiences on two tracks. Like, how do we build a core that we can kind of build habits and relationships with people who are inclined to want to read the 19th day in and day out? And then how can we monetize that audience so that we can extend beyond and really go and meet, a bigger audience where they are?
Awesome. Now, speaking of audiences, we have one watching right now, and I'm going to encourage everyone who's watching, if you've got questions, go ahead and start typing them into the chat. We're not going to have a sharp break between this discussion and the audience Q&A. I will try to DJ in some questions from the chat as our discussion rolls forward. So go ahead and start typing in your questions. I will now take moderator's prerogative to ask another one, though. What does a nonprofit business model, what does your business model look like? Or what are you hoping it will look like as the 19th develops?
Yeah, I mean, I think the hope for us, honestly, is that we can take the best of the Texas Tribune's business model and try to scale it to a national organization. And so what that means is, hopefully very similar in model. It's, philanthropic support, individual philanthropic support. It's foundation support, sustaining support from philanthropic foundations. It's corporate underwriting. It is a robust membership model, the sort of viewers like you, not pay to play, but support us with $19 a year or $19 a month. And then the sort of fifth bucket is ideally live events. And obviously, I'd say the pandemic has put two of those revenue lines into sort of more questionable territory. Obviously, the live events piece, we're doing a lot with virtual events and, so far working pretty hard to monetize those with corporate underwriting. But I think, corporate underwriting, like any nonprofit or any for-profit in this moment, the corporate sphere is a giant question mark right now as, companies reel from the fallout of the pandemic and try to think about and reevaluate their budgets. So we are really lucky that we doubled down on philanthropy in a big way in the very early days of our founding of the 19th. That's put us in a safe spot, and probably a spot that's better than most to withstand what could be a couple years of this pandemic environment. We're hoping that the corporate environment rebounds faster than that, but we are working our damnedest to make sure that we're protecting our team for the long haul here.
Yeah. To turn to some of the questions that we're getting, one of them is just related. We just gotten a question from Josie asking if the 19th is going to be subscription based. Will it be?
No, free to read and free to republish. That's actually really important to us. We feel like as a public service, we want to make sure that everyone who is invested in and impacted by the stories that we tell is able to read them and share them widely. That said, membership is sort of our reader revenue stream, and we hope that we do such a good job at meeting the mission, expressing it with the journalism and in the way that we interact with our audience, that people are inspired to support and help us do more of it with their donations. So yes, we definitely encourage donations. We have a membership program, but we will never ask you to pay to read our journalism day in and day out.
Mm. Josie also asked about intersectionality and how you're thinking of it as you craft the team and the mission of the 19th. And I would ask, to reinforce that and broaden the question too. I would ask, it's been pretty fantastic to see, as a queer person, it's been pretty fantastic to see a real broadening in our understanding of gender generally, and I'm curious how you're thinking about gender diversity as you build your lens to coverage too.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, first of all, it's a work in progress, and part of the, one of the benefits of also gathering a very diverse team is that you're going to learn about what intersectionality means and how it impacts your coverage as you go, as these editorial conversations unfold. Right now, a lot of them are happening in Slack, and you just have a really great dynamic where reporters are coming together, sharing stories, probing, weighing in, asking what the asterisk is. So I think that's the beauty of having the team that we've assembled, one. And two is on the gender aspect of things. One of the things we did really early on was, we started out thinking, are we covering women and the intersection of women, politics and policy? And we said, no, obviously, it's a lot more intersectional and complex than that. So if we're making good on approaching our journalism in a nuanced way, that means that, starting with gender, politics, and policy is the first way to kind of signal that this is the direction that we're headed. So I think it's definitely a work in progress. Emily, what about you?
I mean, everything you said is perfect. I mean, I think one of the things that's felt really liberating about taking this plunge in this moment is the ability for us to come out and say, you know what, there are things that we stand for, and that's okay. We stand for human rights. We stand for gender equity. We stand for racial justice. And our journalism will be, evidence-based, fact-based, and fair under all of these circumstances. But there are guardrails for us. And I think that feels really exciting to be able to say out loud and to do in this moment. And I think that has been really appealing, to this newsroom of extraordinary journalists who have jumped aboard saying, we believe in you and we want to take this risk with you because this is the kind of journalism we want to produce. So it's been pretty thrilling.
Emily, you've mentioned that one of the contextual details right now, one of the pieces of context that's really, I think, shaping all of our newsrooms at the moment has been this reawakened, rekindled civil rights movement that we've been seeing. And how is that shaping the 19th? How is it shaping how you're thinking of covering your coverage, and how is it shaping the team itself?
I mean, it's interesting because obviously this is front and center for us as it is for a lot of newsrooms, and it's critical to our coverage lines right now. But we always were very intentional about intersectionality. And honestly, from day one, from the evolution of that asterisk we talked about, we knew the kind of newsroom that we wanted to build. I think this moment in history has just made our work feel even more critical. I mean, Erin Haynes on our team, she wrote the first story nationally about Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor was not a household name at all in the moment that Erin wrote this story. And honestly, the family, Breonna Taylor's family, reached out to Erin and said, we hear that you all at the 19th are thinking about gender, race and gender. And we think, that when Black men are killed by police, they get stories written about them more frequently than Black women who are killed by police. And we want to sort of change the dynamic around that, which was a fascinating gender lens through which to tell this really critical national story. That story, we posted it on the Washington Post. It just, went completely viral. Suddenly, Breonna Taylor's name was, being lifted up at protests and around the country. And I think, so it's always been intentional for us, but I think in this moment, we are all learning a lot. I mean, I think Amanda and I both, I'll only speak for myself, like this has been an awakening for me personally. Obviously, this is a work in progress, and we're so lucky to have a newsroom that we can learn from in this really pivotal moment in history.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would add to that, it's about the journalism and the way the journalism happens every day. I can tell you that our reporters are coming into this newsroom, virtual as it is, and there's already this like exhale sigh of relief that some of the assignments that they were accustomed to pitching in whatever their former contexts were, that maybe have been sidelined or where they would have gotten pushback, where their ideas are being embraced and encouraged. And so I think that there's more of that, but also just the way that we operate. I have thought a lot about my role, and it won't be a surprise maybe to some people here that I've spoken with this about, but just the idea that I am a Mexican-American daughter of an immigrant, but present as white, and just really doing my own reckoning with what that means in the news industry. I think for me, one of the big takeaways is that, the industry can't, be credible in calling out systemic racism externally if it's not also willing to examine how it operates as an industry. And that, I'm also super committed to ensuring that, what the work that we're doing here to elevate women of color, to create opportunities for them to advance in journalism and for them to tell the stories that they are able and need and want to tell is also super important, that we're creating opportunities for them to grow, that we're being equitable in our own hiring processes. Like all of those things really matter too. And I just hope that there's more of that kind of conversation happening in newsrooms nationwide, because those conversations are overdue.
Can you talk a little bit about the behind the scenes, how you're approaching building organizational policies, in support infrastructures for your employees, and how what sorts of things you're doing to make it possible to build a more equitable newsroom?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it starts with communication. We are, as a team, we're together every Monday on a Zoom. We have happy hours every Wednesday. It starts with just building relationships as a team. It also begins with entertaining questions. When the George Floyd protests were erupting across the country, and we had members of our staff who were wanting to know, how can we engage with these protests? What are the guardrails, whether you're in the newsroom or editorial side or more on the product and design side, and being willing to have those conversations and re-examine some of the policies that we come into the newsroom with as sort of the default, and say, maybe those don't need to be the default. It starts with, when Aaron Haynes is like, why isn't Juneteenth a holiday? Not just sort of putting it aside as sort of an HR, just because that's how we do it, and actually saying maybe Juneteenth should be a staff holiday. Emily and I had a conversation on the hiring stuff and decided, like, actually it's really important for us to be more transparent about starting salaries for our positions, and that's something that we're going to do going forward. So it starts with building relationships with your team and creating safe, constructive spaces for them to come to you with their questions, with their concerns, and being able to entertain those in a meaningful way. And so that they're actually seeing that their voice matters, and that they're helping to shape what we're doing here. It's not just Emily and I go into a room somewhere and decide, and that's it. We really, from the beginning, I mean, even when we were sort of in stealth mode, we would have retreats where we would pull women of color that we loved and admired from across the country to really test some of the assumptions that we were making and the ideas that we had about the 19th. And so that's just part of our DNA. And I think it's going to continue to be as we, again, shape and reshape these policies going forward.
Yeah.
I would just add to that, one thing that I'm learning a lot, and I honestly am learning it the best from Amanda, is how, as a white newsroom leader of privilege, to put my defensiveness aside and my preconceived notions of how things ought to be or how they've always been. That's a really hard thing to do, and it's critically important to ensuring that you're listening to your team and evolving with your team. I mean, I think just one thing I'd add to that is giving women the opportunity to get ahead by providing the kind of salaries and benefits that they need to best do their jobs. So for us from day one, paid leave policies have been really important, not just sort of 6 months of fully paid family leave for anybody on our team, but also 4 months of fully paid caregiver leave. So if you need to spend the last 4 months of your mom or dad's life with them, or you're grappling with an illness due to, look at COVID in this moment, that you have that flexibility without getting off the path. I think those are the kind of things that have been critical for us, that we are hoping the rest of the industry takes notice and follows suit, so that we can ensure that women stay on this sort of escalator to, top newsroom leadership that I think too many women step off, and too many women of color step off too early.
Maria asks in the chat a really good related question, which is, knowing that women suffer disproportionate attacks from the audience and the public and people that are being interviewed for stories, are you thinking about how you'll support them psychologically, and what are you doing to help your staff weather being on the internet?
Yeah, we just wrapped, we had a 2-day staff retreat, 2 days of Zoom, nothing but Zoom, and what they had fun, or at least they're telling me that. No, it was really good. So just taking a time out to talk through some of that stuff. We had a session on digital safety and harassment. It is something we are definitely trying to be proactive about, helping our staff, first of all, recognize that yes, we are more vulnerable just by virtue of the work that we are doing, and the environment in which we are operating, and trying to figure out, what are tools that we can put into place. We've got a Slack channel called SOS, so that when folks are really dealing with a flare up of harassment online, that they have a place to go, that they're not dealing with it alone. Talking through what does a protocol or a checklist look like if someone's getting doxxed. Trying to kind of reevaluate our security, digital security, providing tools for reporters so that they don't feel like they're having to pay for this stuff out of pocket, but figuring out, what are the basics that we can provide for people. And then obviously realizing that when stuff, blows up, you have a lot of times you don't really know what you're dealing with, but just figuring out how to be present and making sure your team knows that they can count on you to send up a flare and say, hey, I need help with this. So
yeah. I want to come to a question from Mandy in the chat, which is, how are you thinking, this dovetails with the question I was hoping to ask as well, how are you thinking about state and local coverage, particularly coming into the election season? Emily, you mentioned the sort of regional presence of several of the staff already, but are you planning to focus or pair with local outlets in any way?
So I think the first thing I'd say is we intentionally did hire a reporter who's covering state houses across the country. And so Barbara Rodriguez is her name. She's in Des Moines, was at the Des Moines Register, terrific reporter who is going to be covering sort of the through lines from state legislatures nationally in the ways and the laws that they're passing that disproportionately affect women. So there will be sort of a state-based focused, although not in necessarily individual states unless we do sort of deeper dives there. I think our local and regional strategy right now is largely to find key examples in states and local municipalities that allow us to highlight and elevate stories that are sort of national themes. You can expect to see us doing in our first year a lot of partnering with other news organizations. Amanda mentioned, our first local news partnership was with the Philadelphia Inquirer. It's an ongoing partnership with the Philadelphia Inquirer, and we didn't even really have a full staff yet. But I think you can imagine seeing more things like that. I think you'll see a pretty aggressive distribution and republishing strategy for us, both nationally and locally over the next year. I think, obviously our goal is to get into as many communities as possible by distribution and by with our journalists scattered around the country. Amanda, anything to add there?
No, just that we also took account last week, and we have, I think, reporters in 9 different states. So yes, we have the State House's reporter, but also just even collaborating across the team when there's an issue that we want to examine. We've got folks on the ground across the country, and super excited to see that play out.
We've had multiple questions in the chat about this question of how you think about the distinction between journalism and advocacy, or old school journalism, or old school or conventional journalism and advocacy. And I'm curious, how do you think the 19th will hew to conventional journalistic lines, and where do you think that newsrooms have actually had bad practices in the past?
I mean, I guess I can start and say, I'm sort of a purist. I think Amanda and I were both probably raised in newsrooms that would sort of hew more to the sort of straight down the middle standpoint. And I think journalism should let the facts and evidence speak for itself and let readers make up their own minds. I'm not, there's a reason that we aren't launching the 19th with an op-ed page or with an editorial page. I think the goal for us is to tell extraordinary stories, give readers the tools and information they need to make their own decisions and go from there. So I think the term, I don't love the term advocacy journalism. I think if journalism is doing its job, it should be exposing great truths that readers need to consume in order to be the most engaged versions of themselves in our democracy. So I don't know, that's sort of where I come down on advocacy versus, but as I said before, I think there's a way to do that and also stand for facts and evidence and science and stand for basic human rights. You don't need both sidesism when something is just patently false.
There have been, I would say, at this moment, amidst this reascendant civil rights movement, I think that there have been a number of questions in newsrooms about what activity can journalists comfortably partake in. Is it okay to post Black Lives Matter in a Twitter bio? Is it how do we think about journalists going to, what's the line between covering a protest, observing one, and participating one? How are you thinking about these policies as your work gets underway?
We've been talking a lot about this, and at the end of the day, we still have come back to some pretty standard policies as it pertains to our journalists, in that we don't ever want to blur the lines where the public can't tell if we're participating in the story, if we are the story, or if we're reporting on the story. So I think that is where we start, but at the same time, I think we acknowledge that, our stand for equity and human rights, we are not going to equivocate on that. And going and observing, the Black Lives Matter protests on your front door and handing water to people in the heat in need, we're not going to discourage anyone from exercising basic humanity. But I mean, apart from that, I think we're trying to also be nimble here and say, here are the basic guardrails. And if you have a question, please come talk to us, whether it's a tweet that you're sending or something that's happening in your backyard. And also, I mean, we were just talking about this the other day too on a call, in terms of volunteering, we expect that the members of our staff are going to be involved and engaged in their communities, and we don't want to be discouraging them from participating or exercising their, being engaged civically. I think we still, that said, we still maintain the basic standards of, we don't want to raise any appearances of conflict with our journalism. We are a nonpartisan newsroom at the end of the day. In order to do a good job at, maintaining that credibility and letting the facts speak for themselves, we need to make sure that we're preserving, that journalistic integrity, and that includes avoiding the appearances of conflicts.
One of our participants from India asks the question, where are you getting your data or stories from? And I guess I'll point that question at are there particular places where you are looking for either, genuine sources of data or sources that don't appear often enough in the rest of the media's coverage that you are looking to amplify in their role in your coverage?
I mean, I think the short answer to that is all over the place. There are, there's a wealth of data, and actually there are really terrific organizations, many of them in university settings where there are enormous collections of data looking at the role of women in American politics, looking at the role of women in our economy. I mean, we've been in close contact with the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers University, which has done a ton of work in this arena. I was on the phone a couple of days ago with some researchers at the University of Houston. I mean, there are outlets for this incredible data collection all over the country. And I think we want to be partnering with them and want to be finding ways to more deeply publicize that data. So if you've got it, send it our way.
So Rasika from Texas mentions an article that I'm as an Atlantic alum, I am surprised and somewhat delighted to see this story still coming up. Why women still can't have it all. Anne-Marie Slaughter. She mentions that, or Rasika mentions that. We've seen a couple of other female writers and influencers emphasizing that having it all is a myth. Trying to persuade that motherhood is a challenge for having a career, and asks for your stand on that question.
I mean, look, I can only speak from my experience. Am I trying to have it all? Yeah, sure. Am I succeeding? Of course not. I mean, I think, I've told this story about, like, there have been days where I've been, on the phone with big potential, prospective donors to the 19th, and I'm literally like stiff arming my daughter to keep her off of the screen. Most days, I feel like I'm not doing anything well. But I think, we are trying, Amanda and I and our team, we are trying to create an environment where women feel like they can have it all by virtue of the fact that we give them the flexibility and the benefits they need to do it. And I think part of, look, this is nothing against men. We've got at least one incredible guy on our team, but I think the real beauty of having a newsroom that is filled with so many women. If you were a fly on the wall for our Slack conversations, it's like, people are comfortable talking about their efforts to get pregnant and what they're enduring, and people are confident about, talking about the division of labor with their partners in their household, and bouncing ideas off of each other. And we're super comfortable saying, you know what? My day right now, because of COVID and daycare, my day has to end at 4:30 or 5 o'clock so I can get my daughter, but expect that I'm back online at 8 o'clock, sending some different notes along or Slack messages along. It's a newsroom that is filled with empathy and understanding. And I think what women on our team are telling us over and over again is, never would have been able to speak this freely in my last newsroom. And that is, somebody sent me a Slack message yesterday about menopause. And it was like, I can never imagine in a million years having a conversation on work time about how you're feeling about menopause. It's a gift.
The other thing, just to I want to underline here, I'm not a mom, I'm a dog mom. I'm not like I have no tiny humans who depend on me. I'm like super Thea, and that's fine. I'll just leave it at that. But I do think it doesn't necessarily have to be a binary. You can either work or not work to have a family. What I think we've also seen, and not just us, but if you look at other workplaces that were super rigid or insistent on a certain way of operating, is the pandemic has made clear you can be remote, you can be flexible in your work hours, and creating, just the flexibility that your teams need in order to be able to accommodate their real life. And I've just it's been incredible to watch how efficient, effective we have been, and not just at getting the work done and the to-dos checked off, but also still making space to really connect. And we met as a team for the last 2 days of last week, and I've never met some of these women in person, and I feel so connected. So that has also been, like, going back to the silver linings, one of the really magical parts about this period in time is kind of calling BS on the idea that you have to have a certain operational structure in order to be efficient and for, for people to get their work done. That's clearly not true.
Yeah. We've had a few questions that I would characterize this way. I'm going to mention Ashik has asked this question. I've seen a couple other folks post this in the chat. But I guess to frame this question, so Ashik asked, why are many women leaders being bashed by other leaders who cannot accept them in male-dominated environments as they speak out about unfairness? I guess the gloss I'd put on that question is, obviously we still live in a context where misogyny can be pretty rampant, and where patriarchy is still kind of a baseline presence of everything. And how are you thinking about actual anti-women discrimination, misogyny, and the patriarchy as you craft the organization? How is it? How have they factored into? Have they been obstacles at all, or have they been things that you've confronted as you've been building the 19th? And how are you thinking about challenging them as you lead the 19th?
I mean, I think I would start by saying that all of these things are, these are storylines that we intend to cover. Like, these are, these are deeply important issues to be grappling with, and we'll do it through our journalism. I mean, from the standpoint of launching the 19th, look, I just have to be honest, like, this was a moment, and from the standpoint of building this venture and fundraising for this venture, overwhelmingly, we have felt enormous support from our male allies and mentors, from the people who we've grown up with in the different journalism organizations we were in. I think we feel beyond lucky in that regard. Like, the worst thing probably that has happened, I mean, there have been people, there are Twitter trolls who will basically come after you and say, this doesn't need to exist, you all are part of the problem. But I also think there have been a couple instances, I've told this story before, but there was at least one incident where I was fundraising. I went to meet a man to talk about potential support for the 19th. And he said to me, I'd be more likely to support you if you uncrossed your arms and you smiled more, because it makes me feel like you're mad at men, which, I was just enthusiastic. It's the fact that I'm even trying to defend myself right now is part of the problem, right? Like, and so I'd say there have been some instances like that where I have been stunned and sat back and said, oh my God, like, this is still a problem. And if this is a problem for me, imagine what this problem is like. I also know that there are donors that could give twice or three times what they give, or foundations that could give twice or three times what they give. And I've seen them give twice or three times what they gave me to organizations that are led by men. And it makes you stop and just wonder, am I not aggressive enough as a woman in this sphere to be asking for double or triple, or are they not giving it to us because, we're women running this organization? You can play those games in your head. There's probably some truth there. There's probably some lack of truth there. But I think, we're just sort of powering through this to try to build the best possible organization we can. Amanda, anything else about
I would add to that a couple things. One is that I think Emily, being like the eternal optimist, and like, just once she sets her mind on something, there's no stopping her. So I think it is worth appreciating the moments of doubt, particularly in stealth mode, where we were really questioning whether we could succeed because maybe other people were raising questions that made us second guess ourselves. And it was a choice to kind of override that fear and doubt. And I think that was potentially an imposition that I'm glad that we overcame. And two is that I don't think that you can look at this issue again without looking at race. I think, to be honest, like, Emily's ability to succeed in doing this has a lot to do with the fact that she is white and well-connected. And like, that shouldn't go without saying, that we have the privilege of being able to speak up and barrel through and overcome and not take no for an answer, because we're white. And when a lot of our peers, women of color, aren't afforded the same leeway. And I think that's BS. Like, I just think that we need to acknowledge that for what it is. And then the second thing I would say too is on the editing side. I don't want to speak out of turn. Andrea, our editor-in-chief, and Abby Johnston, our deputy editor, have been assembling this team of journalists. And I do think that that's one thing that has already come up in the edit process of just, journalists coming to these two editors and recognizing the difference in editing with them versus maybe with some of their male colleagues in other organizations. Like, it is making a difference already, I think.
Let me ask a big, broad question to you both. How are you defining success? What will success look like a year from now, 5 years from now?
You're talking to Amanda, who is the queen of KPIs.
Yeah, I mean, I want us to be a household name. We already are well on our way. I mean, the fact that people who I know are not, plugged into politics and journalism nerd Twitter know the 19th exists and are excited to learn more about it. Like, we want to be a household name, breaking the kind of news that puts us on par with all of the other major national political news organizations in the country. So journalistically, I want us to have that gravitas. And then, I want to have a critical mass in terms of our audience of people who are coming to consume our journalism on a day-to-day basis, that we've got the membership program that reflects that we're hopefully doing a good job along those lines of delivering the kind of news and experiences that they expect from us and that they believe in and agree that we're executing in line with our mission. So I would say those are a few of the markers that I kind of see in the 3 and 5 year range. And I'm hoping and pretty optimistic that we'll get there even sooner.
The only thing I would add to that is I want to build a newsroom culture that is the gold standard for the industry. And I hope we're well on our way to doing that.
Awesome. What is the role? I'm going to ask a question from Julia from Brazil. And maybe I'll point this at you first, Amanda. What is the role that engagement reporting is playing in your work?
We know this, Julia from Brazil. I think we used to work together.
Yeah, I mean, I feel I started working in audience, I think it's already been a decade, which is ridiculous and makes me feel old. But I think it's very important to have an audience strategy that prioritizes listening to your audience. Like, well, first of all, being intentional about who you want your audience to be, and going for, beyond just sort of big numbers and page views, but really thinking about, okay, I want a diverse audience of women, geographically diverse, racially diverse. So like actually naming the audience that you're going for. And then creating the time and space to be proactive about going and finding that audience and not expecting them to come to you. Hopefully you're doing a good job of having the journalism that is relevant to those communities. And once you do, being willing to spend the time and energy, the boots on the internet ground, so to speak, to go out and to find those readers where they are, and ask them, what stories do they have to tell? What questions do they have about this reporting? To not assume that we know everything. I think just a big dose of humility and some good old fashioned, time and energy to spend the effort to go out and meet these readers where they are. So yes, that's an important part of our audience strategy, and it will be reflected in the reporting and the community building that you start to see on the site as we get up and running.
We've had a few questions about what type of donor base you're striving for. Are you going to focus your efforts at the outset at big donors? Are you hoping for a big small dollar donor base as well? I'm guessing I know the answer to this question, but how are you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the takeaway on this, obviously, we want a ton of small dollar donors, right? Like we want the member community to be super robust and to have a ton of people who are bought into our mission. And that is a huge priority. In the first 24 hours after our soft launch in January, we raised something like close to $100,000 in those small dollar gifts, like $19 gifts. These were from women primarily around the country. And we are hoping for a similar bump around our full launch, which you'll get to see before too long here. But I think from the development strategy, you know, we want a diverse subset of major donors. We want folks who can give anywhere from $1,000 to $1 million. Obviously, it's impossible to get off the ground without at least a small number of those high dollar donors. But from my standpoint, from my priority, I mean, I'm spending most of my days talking to people who are giving anywhere from $5,000 to $100,000.
So last question, we've got 1 minute left, and I just want to know, for those of us who are really eager to see the 19th launch and to start to see the coverage, give us a teaser. What should we be most excited for? What are you most excited to deliver to the public?
Amanda?
Oh, I was just texting you. Mention.
Oh, all right, I'll start. I mean, yeah, first is we have announced our, the 19th Represents, which is our inaugural launch summit, or it's our inaugural summit, Women's Summit, only launching one time, thank God. So that's August 10th through 14th. You can register online for it. It is gonna be amazing. We have, you know, speaking signups from everyone from Kamala Harris to Stacey Abrams, Elise Stefanik, Melinda Gates, Hillary Clinton, Meryl Streep, Zoe Saldana. I mean, the entire New York Philharmonic Orchestra is performing via Zoom the work of 3 young Black women composers. The Go-Go's are getting back together, the first all-woman band to top the Billboard charts. I mean, the lineup is sick. And so you absolutely have to attend, and it's free. So do that. And also, you know, you're gonna see us launch here pretty darn soon. So stay tuned.
Yeah, the URL for that is summit.19thnews.org.
Amazing. Well, Amanda, Emily, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Thanks to all of you who joined us from all around the world. Thank you to Rosenthal and Mallory and Susie and Grace and the rest of the crew at ISOJ for facilitating a wonderful session. I'm so honored and glad to be with you this morning, and so looking forward to your launch. Congratulations and good luck.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt, so much for moderating. We appreciate it.
So grateful to be here. We love you, ISOJ.
Oh my God. Thank you so much. This was really amazing. You know, wow. What an incredible conversation. The 19th is a fantastic project, and this, I will be at the summit, you know, you bet. And this session made me feel emotional for many reasons. I now invite you to watch last year's superb keynote by Matt Thompson. You can find that at isoj.org, as I think that somehow it relates to what we have just heard. But I'm particularly emotional to see Emily and Amanda as a Texas Tribune proud board member since its foundation. I worked with for a decade with Emily there, and seeing her flying to the heights this way is pretty amazing and emotional for me. I also worked with Amanda at the Texas Tribune too, but it is even more emotional in her case because she was my student at the UT School of Journalism, and as an undergrad, Amanda attended the first ISOJ in 1999. So brilliant careers, talk to my heart. Wow. So thank you, Emily, Amanda, and Matt for joining us on our third day of ISOJ. I want to encourage you all to review our program and look at the great lineups ahead of us. If you haven't already done so, go register at Eventbrite. This afternoon, we will have well, next we're gonna have a workshop that you can't miss. It's about TikTok, how journalists can find the stories and find misinformation on TikTok. Then it's followed by an amazing panel that is led by the editorial page editor of the New York Times. It has the top editors of 2 of the most important Latin American newspapers, and it's about and great journalists from Poland and Hungary, and it's about how presidents are weaponizing social media against journalists. And the last panel of the day will be led by my esteemed colleague and partner here at the Knight Center, Mallory Tenori about solutions journalism, which is really going up this day. So please join us, and thank you very much. I love you all. Bye.